Goeienaand luisteraars en baie welkom hier by Eden FM en ons sit koppe by mekaar weer eens op 'n maandag aand. Saam met my is Hans, my ou vriend en goeie vriend wat saam met my gesels vanaand hier en hy het vir ons 'n baie interessante gas saamgebring. Hans, sal jy asseblief ons gas vir ons voorstel?
Ja, dankie Ronel, goeienaand luisteraars. Ek dink een van die voorregte wat ons het om hierdie program aan te bied is dat ons vriende en kennisse wat ons oor die jare verhoudings mee gebou het, kan nooi om te kom saamgesels. En vanaand luisteraars het ons vir Adam Welz wat daar in die Kaap in kommetjie sit om met ons te kom gesels. Hy is is moeilik om te beskryf. Ek ken hom, ek sit net gesit en uit, ek ken hom vir 28 jaar leer ken as 'n fotograaf, maar hy het al meer in die omgewings kwessies betrokke geraak en hy het einde verlede jaar 'n boek gepubliseer, The End of Eden, die einde van Eden. En die boek is baie goed ontvang. Omtrent 'n vol bladsy review gekry in New York Times, was op Apple se lys van beste boeke van Oktober. Die van julle wat die burger koop, afgelope Vrydag het Marie Levita 'n volblad berig gedoen oor 'n onderhoud wat hy met Adam gedoen het. En ja, ons fokus gewoonlik op geestesgesondheid, maar geestesgesondheid en ekosistemiese, die natuur se gesondheid is onoplosmaaklik van mekaar. So Adam, baie welkom hier op Eden FM en sien uit daarna na jou te luister. As ons dalk met jou kan begin, is net 'n vraag, ja, om net so 'n bietjie hoe dit gekom dat jy hierdie boek geskryf het. Waar kom dit vandaan?
Ja, eers wil ek sê baie dankie. Thanks for having me. Ek sal meeste in Engels antwoord want ek is bietjie meer gemaklik in Engels met hierdie vak, kan ek sê, this topic. I felt that I should write the book because I've noticed this thing when it comes to climate change. First of all, we have this thing that most of what gets written about climate change in the media is about humans. But, you know, we share the planet with literally millions of other species, and we read very little about, you know, what climate change is doing to them. And then when we do read about other species and climate change, it tends to be this very generalized thing. You know, people say climate change is going to do this and this to, you know, a whole lot of birds in the world are going to be affected in this way, or you know, X percentage of fish species are going to be affected by climate change. But it's this very general thing that you can't like really understand, or it's information that you can't really do anything with, except it just gives you this feeling of dread, but you don't really know what it means or what to do with it. And then the other thing that I've noticed about climate change and the natural world, when you see stories, sometimes there's like what I call like very small stories about just one species in one place. So you'll read in a newspaper, oh, scientists have discovered that a certain butterfly in California is going extinct because of climate change. But it's this little thing far away that you can't really relate to, and it doesn't seem joined up. So what I try to do with this book is, first of all, put the focus totally on the natural world. Dis nie 'n boek oor mense nie. Mense is heeltemal in die agtergrond, kan ek sê. Daar is menslike karakters. I do deal with some people, but I tried not to name anybody who is still alive. There's only a handful of people in the book that I actually name, and they're all dead, because I don't want this to be like, often the book about environmental stuff or science stuff is told through the character of a scientist. So they start the book about, you know, Professor dit en dat wat, you know, in die veld gaan loop, and, you know, they open the story around the human, but I don't want to do that. I want to focus us on you know, the wild species. So first of all, the focus is very much on the wild species, but second of all, I try to bridge this gap. between the very, very little specific stories and these very big general stories. And I do that by picking different species around the world. I mean, this book has examples from, you know, an enormous variety of places in it. And I tell you a story about this species so that hopefully you can understand the species and empathize with the species, understand the world as this species experiences it and the challenge it faces to stay alive. But then all the way through the book, I take a step back. The book is written in short sections, so it's easy to read. But I take a step back and I try to explain the scientific theory behind what's happening to the species, so that you get an actual understanding that, you know, my aim is that this is a very tough story to tell. It's pretty hard to really try and understand the damage that's being inflicted on the natural world. Is pretty upsetting to a lot of people. But I want you to walk off and think, now that I've read this book, I understand how this is happening. And I feel that's empowering. I don't want to lie to my readers and say, well, ek gaan jou nou 'n storie vertel wat bietjie tough is, maar teen die einde gaan alles alright wees. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to patronize you. But I want you to walk off and say, yeah, there's all this difficult stuff happening, but I understand how it's happening. And I deliberately wrote the book for people who've never done a day of ecology at university in their lives. This is a book that's written for everybody really who's, you know, who can read a book. The feedback I get from people is really good, actually. Honestly, I've got a lot of really great feedback, both from people that have never really thought about environmental stuff before, saying, wow, I really learned a lot, maar ook van wetenskaplikes wat vir my gesê het, wow, daar was stories in daai boek wat ek nie van geweet het nie. Jy weet, ek het iets nuuts daaruit gekry. So overall, you know, I'm pretty satisfied with it.
I want to ask Adam, what is the book about? I'm hearing environmentalist.
Yeah, so
what is it about?
The full title of the book is The End of Eden, and then Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown. So what I'm trying to show you is this is how climate change, or climate breakdown as I prefer to call it, is affecting wild species and natural ecosystems around the world. And each chapter has kind of a theme. So we start off with the first chapter, which I think of as the basics. And this is explaining how each organism, each animal, each plant, each whatever is kind of like its own entity, and it has to interact with the world. It has to make a negotiation, a dance with the world about energy. You know, it has to get energy in and it has to let energy out, you know. And I start these stories with creatures in the Mojave Desert in Southern California, a place that I visited. I also write about the Kalahari in that first chapter and explain how birds are disappearing from the Kalahari because of their relationship with energy, you know. And then I have a chapter about extreme weather, you know, it tells a few stories about hurricanes and floods and things like this. And then I have a chapter about fire, I have a chapter about diseases, I have a chapter about, you know, CO2, and in each chapter, like I say, I just pick a few different species that are like characters in a way in the story, and I tell you their story. And again, I can't tell you the story of every single species on Earth that's being affected by climate change. Those, you know, would be here for 10,000 years writing this book and you would never read it. But I mean, I can tell you a few well-chosen stories that give you some insight as to how this all these processes, these very complicated processes are playing out around the world. So I want you to read the story of whatever, the yellow-billed hornbill in the Kalahari, which is in chapter 1. And I want you to see, oh, this is how this bird is dying out in the Kalahari. This is how the whole thing works. This is the story. And then I want you to be able to use that understanding to realize, well, this is happening to this one species in this place. Well, it means that similar things are happening to lots of other species in other places. You know, it's the stories are chosen in order for you to generate broader insight. It's not just about those things. Yeah.
Adam, if I may ask you to tell the story about the cheetahs in Namibia. I think for us from South Africa, we familiar with cheetahs. If you just...
Ja, so ek bedoel ons is like you say here in South Africa, very familiar with what a lot of people just call veld, savanna. But if you really think about a savanna ecosystem, and by savanna I mean an ecosystem that's made up both of grasses and of trees, okay? But it's not a closed canopy forest. It's not a digte bos of a woud, nie? And it's not just pure grasveld, right? It's not the Karoo either. So we think about a savanna like you would see in the Kruger Park or the Eastern Cape or in the Kalahari. Actually, ecologists have studied these ecosystems for quite a while, and they've learned to understand them as a battleground between trees and grasses. Okay, so grasses are trying to occupy the land, and trees are trying to occupy the land, and they're battling with each other. And the result of the battle is this savanna, this kind of half and half system. And the main thing that, let's say, in the English word I like to use that mediates the battle, that controls this thing, is fire. Okay, so if a fire comes through, fires are regular, they're a totally natural part of these landscapes, right? If a fire comes through an area, that's actually usually good for grasses, because the grasses just burn down, die gras brand af, and dan groei hulle weer van onder af, right? Like veld grasses are adapted to fire. They've dealt with it for millions of years. They start growing from the bottom. But if you're a small tree, like a klein soetdoring of whatever, as jy 'n klein boompie is en die vuur kom, it'll kill you, okay? Unless you're big enough that your top branches, where all the leaves are above the hottest part of the flames. Okay, sodra jy moet ten minste so 5 meter hoog wees as 'n boom if you want to be able to survive a fire, right? So what this means is if fires come along very regularly, very often, the grasses win, because it takes out the small trees before they can get to the fire safe height, before they can escape the fire trap, as we put it. Maar so usually with most of these savanna trees, it takes them 5 or 6 years to grow to a fire safe height. And if the fires come on average more often than every 5-6 years, then they don't get to dominate the landscape. Every now and again there'll be a gap between a fire of say 10 years, and then some of the trees will be able to reach fire safe height. But then if the regular fires come along, they won't be able to create a forest. Maar wat nou gebeur, wat baie interessant is, with the rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, grasses and trees, of course, use CO2 to make their bodies, to make carbohydrates that they build themselves out of, and they, of course, release oxygen into the air at the same time, right? This is what plants do. But they have different ways. They do this through photosynthesis. They have different methods of photosynthesis. Most grasses, most trees, they have different ways of dealing with photosynthesis. And what's really interesting is that as the CO2 concentration has been rising in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, especially in the recent decades, just in the last 30-40 years, trees, because of their photosynthetic system, can take advantage of this, and they are literally growing much faster than they were just 20-30 years ago. Okay, the average savanna tree, soetdoring especially, 𝗏𝘅cia 𝘐𝑪𝑢, this tree that we see everywhere, they're growing faster now than they were since even in my lifetime. They've been growing faster. And what this means, but the grasses, because grasses use a different photosynthesis system, they can't take advantage of the new higher CO2 concentrations. So the grasses are still growing at the same speed, more or less, than they were growing at. What this means is trees reach a fireproof height much faster than they used to, and they reach a fireproof height in a shorter space of time, which means that the fires don't take them out of the landscape like they used to. And what we're seeing now is this incredible thing called, bush encroachment, they call it, especially in Namibia, where these open savannas that used to only have just a few trees and lots of grass are becoming these thickets, almost like forests of thorn trees. And it's driving out the grass-loving species. And it actually also, it's driving out the cows. I mean, Namibia's beef production is like less than half of what it was in the 1980s because of this, this bush encroachment. And so to tell that story, I focused in on the cheetah because it's an animal that we all know. But a cheetah is the ultimate grassland animal. It's the ultimate, it needs space, right? Its advantage is speed. And it has these incredible eyeballs, this incredible eyesight that have evolved in this very bright, open landscape. And now what's happening is these cheetahs are just being pushed out of, by now, actually literally millions of hectares in the recent years, because the trees, everything is just closing in. And they can't find that open space to run uninterrupted. And a lot of them are actually getting eye injuries because of the thorns that they run into thorns now that they never used to. But also what's happening with the arrival of this woody kind of invasion is leopards are coming into these landscapes. The leopards didn't used to do well in the open area. Leopards like the dark. Leopards hunt at night. They like this thick stuff. And leopards are bigger, stronger animals than cheetahs. And they're literally pushing cheetahs out of these territories and killing them outright. So we're seeing this whole change in these massive ecosystems, and it's due to CO2 going up in the air and acting like a fertilizer for trees, which again, to some people might sound like a great idea. Whoa, die bome groei groter en vinniger, jy weet. Alles is lekker, bome is goed, jy weet. But no, because actually large chunks of the world are naturally open ecosystems. They're not forests. And in many cultures, we see this, what I call the reification of trees, almost like people almost worship trees, but they don't think of veld grasses as being important, or worthy of consideration. But actually, there's huge tracts of the earth that are naturally covered with grasses and grassy savannas, and there's a lot of ecological advantages to keeping them that way and not turning into these thickets of trees. And I want people to think about that too, to reconsider their prejudices they might have about what the best kind of plants are, for example,
Very interesting. Luisteraars, ek dink as julle lus het om saam te gesels, stuur asseblief vir ons 'n WhatsApp by 060 505 2693. Ek herhaal 060 505 2693. Adam, ek het byvoorbeeld nog nooit eers gedink aan die verhouding tussen bome en die spesies nie, maar dit maak net soveel sin. If there's no veld for them to run in, what happens then, and how the one thing influence the other. Luisteraars, welkom terug hier by Eden FM en ons sit koppe bymekaar en ons gesels vanaand met Adam Welz, 'n baie interessante gesprek. Adam, hier's 'n vraag. Hans is eintlik aan jou geadresseer, maar ek lees hom nou sommer. Ek sou graag wil hoor of klimaatsverandering enige positiewe impakte kan hê. Ek is deeglik bewus van die negatiewe impakte, maar in die geskiedenis van moeder aarde het daar tog goeie goed post-events of mass extinction gebeur. Heel waarskynlik positiewe planeet, maar nie vir mensdom nie, van Stefan Henrico. Baie dankie vir jou vraag. Adam, hoe lyk dit? Is daar positiewe goed wat uit...
I mean, this question honestly confuses me. And I'll tell you why. Because how do you define positive and negative in this terms of this question? Well, yes, in the past, if you look through the depths of geological time and you go back to the beginning of life on Earth, you travel back hundreds of millions of years, there were these times where there were big mass extinction events, and then certain creatures went extinct, and then others evolved and came to dominate. I know the famous thing being the extinction of the dinosaurs, and then how mammals, you know, became more prevalent and eventually giving rise to us, right? So we could say, oh, was the extinction of the dinosaurs a positive thing because it led to humans coming into being? Well, maybe it was positive for us, you know, but it certainly wasn't positive for the dinosaurs. You know? And so, like, again, whose perspective are you talking about when you talk about positive? How do you define that? And I think, you know, this question to me, and forgive me if I'm getting it wrong here, but this question for me is actually a different way of framing another question that I often get. And the other question I often get is there hope? Okay, and this is what I want to know. For me, this is another way of asking that question. It's Stefan's question that he just sent us now. And I don't like the concept of hope in this thing, because, I mean, what do you want me to tell you? Okay, do you want me to tell you, oh yes, there's hope, you know, we've got all these new technologies and solar and whatever, and we can stop burning all this terrible polluting fossil fuel, and then we'll solve this climate change problem and it's all going to be fine? And if I tell you that, well, then you have your excuse to go and sit in the corner and do nothing, right? Because it's all going to be fine. Die smart mense gaan dit alles uitsorteer en ek kan maar net soort van aanhou soos ek altyd aangehou het. Or do you want me to tell you, oh no, there's no hope. It's a complete disaster. This is the world is coming to an end. It's an apocalypse. It's a total, you know, no hope, which actually it could have the same result, right? It could also give you an excuse to sit in the corner and do nothing. Because wat kan ek doen? Dis so groot ding wat hier aankom, en wat is ek is net een klein mensie hier so, en wat kan ek doen? So ek gaan maar net aan, you know. And for me, both of those answers are a cop-out, because that doesn't address the truth of the situation. The truth of the situation is, yes, maybe like if we destroyed most of life on Earth, you know, say within the next decades, and we made ourselves extinct along with, you know, half of the other species on Earth, you know, Earth might, you know, new species, of course, they would evolve, things would happen, Earth would recover. But I mean, if we go by the previous mass extinctions, it would take about 10 million years for Earth to evolve that sort of diversity again. 10 million years is a meaningless time frame for me. I'm a human, right? I care about me. I care about my children, maybe the children's generation. 10 million years I'm not interested in 10 million years from now, honestly. And what's actually happening is, it's not like I say over and over again, this is not like an on-off switch. It's not like climate change is a complete disaster or it's going to completely be okay. The point is, we are progressively disrupting a very complex system that for the last while has been really stable. I mean, actually our human civilizations grew up in the last 10, 11,000 years. You know, this is where settled. And this period of time we call the Holocene, the climate has been incredibly stable in this time. And climate stability is the friend of civilization, but it's also the friend of wild species, because it cuts down extinction rates massively. It really reduces extinction rates. We look at places on Earth that have been climate stable for a really long time, like the Southwestern Cape around Cape Town. The Fynbos is this mega diverse ecosystem because the climate here has been incredibly stable for a super long time. Other parts of the world where the climate has been wildly unstable have far fewer species and far less stable ecosystems, natural ecosystems. We can see this. And so what we're doing now is I say, we're influencing the climate more and more by throwing all these pollutants up there. But because it's a complex system, the more we influence, the less control we have on the outcome. The more unpredictable the system becomes, the more strange stuff starts to happen, the more unpredictable stuff starts to happen as this system starts rearranging and breaking apart and what have you. So I always say to people, I don't think about, you know, when you start talking, is there a positive side, is there a negative side? Ek wil nie sê dis is positief of negatief nie. Ek wil net sê wat is. And what is, I mean, and that's where the title of the book comes, is that our human species, which evolved in the last 300,000 years or so in its current form, you know, 300,000 years ago, humans started looking like Homo sapiens as we know them today. You know, we evolved in a period of Earth's history where Earth was actually more diverse than it was since the beginning of life. Scientists who've studied this and looked at the fossil records, our species evolved with more other species on the Earth than ever before in history. And then in this most recent part of our history, this 10 to 11,000 years, we had this benefit of this incredibly stable climate, you know, at the end of the last ice age. And we could evolve settled agriculture. We'd stay in one place and we could plant crops, and we could know that the rains were going to come at a certain time and that they were going to grow at a certain time. And then we could build cities and culture and learn how to write, and all of this stuff came out of this incredible stability. The stability is a bedrock of civilization. But again, I also say it's a bedrock of diverse ecosystems, because when the conditions are stable, species don't go extinct, you know, at nearly the same rates as they do when they're unstable. So the truth is, from my perspective, we're in a very difficult situation right now. We're throwing more and more pollution into the air, which is driving this complex system into more and more uncertainty and more instability. But the less rubbish we throw in the air, the less pollution we throw in the air, the less chance we have of things going, you know, horribly wrong in all sorts of different ways. And so it sits on a continuum, a very complicated continuum. This is not a yes or no answer. I mean, if you want to look for hope, I'll just finish with this. I mean, in the senses, I say this, as I write in the book, this problem is so big and it's so all-encompassing and it affects everything. But that, the flip side, the positive flip side of that, if you like, is that there's something for everybody to do. Because there's all sorts of ways of attacking the problem and all kinds of ways that you can enter the problem and contribute to it, you know. So if you want a positive takeaway, well, that's a positive takeaway. But the positivity only comes through action. It doesn't come through thinking about whether it's hopeful or not hopeful or positive or negative. I mean, maak dit sin vir julle. Ek weet nie. I mean, tell me I'm talking nonsense, but you know, dis hoe ek daaraan dink.
I think let's bring it. Yeah, I almost want to say, Adam, can ons it? You've got triplets, and they're young. And what do you teach them about nature?
I mean, we just entered a phase now. I mean, I've got these 9-year-old girls, and I would say in the last 6 months or so, they've started like reading and sort of thinking about things like pollution and so on. But they're too young to sort of put it in any kind of a real context. So for them, often it is like just a complete disaster. But then it's also they don't really have the tools to think about it yet. So it's a very difficult, look, this is a very difficult topic to deal with adults. Never mind kids, you know. I mean, I mean, the way that I approach the kids is I really try to, in ways sometimes successful, sometimes not, I try to let them start to appreciate nature at least. You know, if we find an insect in the house or whatever, it's not like, bring it doom, you weet, maak hom dood. You know, that's not what I'm doing. You know, I really try and teach them about it, even if it's like a dangerous snake, you know, instead of like reacting with panic, you know, I sort of try to sort of teach them about it and show them sort of just handle it in respect and know about it. And I point out birds to them. Sometimes they think, I mean, I'm a very keen bird watcher, right? And I try to let them listen to birds' songs, what's that singing in the yard or whatever. And again, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes wanneer dis pa en sy fynbos alweer, jy weet, so daai tipe reaksie kry ek ook. Ja, maar partykeer is dit vir hulle nice om iets niets te sien of so aan, jy weet. And I think that for me is just slowly like introduce these, and we do talk about extinctions. We go and we see we live not far from this penguin colony at Boulders Beach here, and our African penguins are in real trouble. They are heading into extinction, like on a superhighway to extinction. I mean, the rate at which those birds' population is dropping is that, the latest calculation is that we will lose them as a wild species by 2035, right? It's 11 years away. The species that's been on Earth for probably a couple million years. So, we go down to the penguins, we talk about the penguins, and then we do talk about this, but I try and do it in a gentle way so that they don't just completely freak out, if you know what I mean. And I think the more we start to pay attention, the more we start to understand, and you can do this anywhere. Again, I stayed in this book. I lived in New York for about 6 years, New York City. Some of our best nature experiences were in Manhattan, in New York. There's almost like no place on earth that you can think of as more concrete skyscrapers. I saw incredible nature things. Once you start just paying attention, you don't have to go on a expensive safari into the heart of the wilderness to find nature. You can find it anywhere, and once you start paying attention and just trying to think about, you don't have to be an expert. You just, like I say, we humans evolved to pay attention to nature, right? We wouldn't have survived on the African savannah if we were not really good at understanding nature. All of this stuff is still, even if we urban people and we've lost our connection to nature, all of this stuff is actually still there. All of the wiring is still there, and you can activate it by starting to pay attention to the stuff and starting to learn about it. And I promise you, within a very short space of time, you'll learn more and more and more and more. And for me, it's like this extra dimension on the world. I feel really sorry for people who don't know about nature, don't pay attention to nature, because for me, it's like having this extra richness around me, like all the time, wherever I go. And so with my kids, I try to slowly, and again, sometimes I fail, sometimes I succeed. I try to start getting them just to accept that that's important. And I think we'll get to the heavy stuff when they're older, honestly, because, but I do see among a lot of young people, like say people in their late teens, early 20s, this thing of climate dread is very real. I encounter it in a lot of places I go. I mean, I've been to America recently again, talking to kids at universities. It comes up all the time. And along with this climate dread is a feeling of deep betrayal that the older generations have betrayed us, and a real anger that comes from some young people of like, you've messed it up and now you're leaving it for us to clean up the mess. There's that sort of, that is very common as well. And I think young people, for whatever reason, are much more open to accepting that climate change is a real problem. They're not as reactive as the older folks, often tend to be. So that's a very long-winded, indirect response maybe to your question. But again, I do sense, especially in the US now, there's a kind of a generational shift that young people think about climate in a very different way, in general, than older people do. And yeah, they're really worried. But I don't think we deal with that worry by telling them, there, it's not a problem, or there's nothing you can do about it anyway, or all of these responses. You have to, for me, I'm like, yeah, it is a problem. You're right. It's not wrong to feel afraid of a serious problem. I would say that's a sane response, honestly. And And so when you address the problem and you just say, well, yeah, this is real. But then how do you, again, the trick is, how do you transition to some kind of action that at least, deals with it? And I mean, look, I've been massively depressed about it because I've studied this stuff. It's a bit like, I say, like writing this book, it sometimes was a bit like grinding my face in broken glass, in a sort of psychological way. It was seriously traumatizing, honestly. I mean, I don't like turning everything into trauma, but it was difficult. And the only reason I got through it, I tell people, is cheap antidepressants and exercise. Those little pills really bloody helped me. But and I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that. So how do you transition? And I also think the only thing that also gets me through often is a curiosity. If the world is going to go to hell in a handbasket, if everything's going to be the apocalypse, is going to be a disaster, I want to be there to see it. I want to see what that really looks like. I don't want to check out early before the main show. You know what I'm saying? No, seriously. And again, but I think a lot of maybe people can start to appreciate that, because there's so much about the contemporary media culture that's about creating safety and illusion and creating these simple storylines that always end in the right way or whatever. That's untrue. And I think, a lot of young people feel that that's untrue, but they can't really articulate it why, and if you say to them, yeah, this is things really can go badly wrong. And there isn't a necessary happy ending to any of this, if you're like real about that, then and you engage it with some level of empathy, and even some dark humor, then maybe we can start a conversation that's a little bit more, at least a little more honest about this, which I think people do actually ultimately appreciate, even if the conversation is difficult. Like, I do sometimes get people say, oh, I can't read your book, that's too sad, that's too depressing. It's like, okay, fine, whatever, that's your prerogative. But honestly, the most of the response I get is, wow, that book was really tough, and there were bits that really were really sad and hard to read, but ultimately I feel like empowered by it. Ultimately I feel like I learned something. Ultimately I feel like I'm a little more connected to what's going on out there. So I mean, to have those kind of conversations, I think, is also kind of helpful. We're talking about psychological, because we don't deal well with uncertainty, but we've got to somehow figure this out, because we are generating, in ecological terms, we're generating a much more uncertain world than existed before. There's no doubt about that. There's no debate about that. It's like,
So Adam, wat kan een enkele klein mensie doen?
Maar
Just be more aware, just be
again,
more
no, there's
aware
no
of
just
what we
here. There's no just.
Okay, sê vir ons, sê vir ons. Sê vir
Ek
ons.
bedoel, soos wat ek sê is, I mean, obviously the first step is to understand the problem, right, as well as you can. And again, you don't have to be a multi-award winning physicist, I mean, there's a lot of material online that can explain how climate change works and global warming works in terms that nearly everybody can understand. And again, I try to do that in my book in different ways and so on. But and then I think you start iteratively. You start with little, what can I do that I can make bigger, and how do I build this out into a community level thing? Because ultimately, wat gaan een mens doen? Well, the answer is more or less niks. Okay, maar as jy in 'n samelewing iets begin verander. I always say, it's like, for example, like, why do I have to drive my big polluting car to work every day? Why can't I go on a bicycle? Well, it's because the city council hasn't put a safe bike lane in, for example. Well, how do I change that? Well, maybe the first step is just try riding my bicycle to work, and then seeing where all the problems are, and then trying to find other people who can club together and generate real political power. Because, and again, you can't be scared, and I say this in the book as well, is people that have an understanding of this and want to change this and want to do something about this problem have to not be scared about acquiring and using political power. You can't be just right and ineffective. You know, jy kan sit in die hoek en jy kan heilig wees en al die goeie dinge doen vir jouself, but you know, you can turn this into a very inward looking thing, but ultimately that's pointless. You know, you've got to figure out, you've got to get into the dirty world of politics in some way or another, you know, and whether that's formal politics or informal politics, you know, that's you know, I'm not saying you have to be in the formal politics, but how do you think about, how do you act in your community? How do you make this thing into a bigger, more joined up thing? You know, how do you start from yourself and ripple outwards, kan ek sê? You know, that's how I would want to think about it.
Thank you so much. Luisteraars, ek het nou so lekker geluister en ek gaan definitief nou dadelik vir my daai boek bestel. Die boek waarvan ons praat is Adam Welz The End of Eden, Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown. En dit is geskryf van die natuurse perspektief af en ek dink ons almal moet daai boek lees. Ek gaan hom luister. En hy is ook beskikbaar op audiobooks vir die van ons wat ook daarvan hou om na 'n boek te luister terwyl ons iewers heen ry of so, of op ons fiets ry of stap. Adam, thank you so much. Dit is beskikbaar in die meeste boekwinkels in Suid-Afrika. Julle kan net daar gaan kyk. En thank you so much. It was so valuable for me to listen to you, and I hope we'll have a chance in future soon to speak again.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks so much for having me. It was a good conversation, although I did most of the talking. Next time you can talk more.
No, we want to learn from you and listen to you. I think you've got a lot to share. Thank you. It's valuable. Hans, is daar 'n laaste woord van jou kant af?
Ja, dankie vir jou tyd, Adam. I think, you know, like this interconnectedness of life, you know, and you know, hopefully we can you spoke about paying attention to nature, to life, and bringing that to your children, your triplets. And you know, I hope that the listeners sal ook vanaand iets daarvan gehoor het. Jy weet dat ons dit verskuldig is aan die lewe om aandag te gee aan die goed hier om ons, om nie te kyk. En ek dink wat ek miskien kan bysê is om saam met jou in die veld te gaan stap is altyd vir my. Ek sien goed, ek nog nooit voor die gesê het, al stap ons al jare in daai selfde paadjie. Jy weet, ja, om goed vir die eerste keer raak te sien, bekende goed, is transformerend, en ja, dat ons mekaar uitnooi en in die hand vat om daai paadjie te kies om te stap. Maar baie dankie en voorspoed vir jou boek, Adam. We so excited.
Luisteraars, ons luister dan nou na Spoeg Wolf se Verander, en ons gesels weer met julle volgende maandag. 'n lekker week vir julle almal.